Now that we covered the retouching process for a typical portrait image, I want to talk about color toning because with color work, it can vary based on personal taste. And although I understand that there's more exemptions than rules when it comes to color, I want to at least give you some of the tools that you can use when it comes to changing some of the mood in the image that we can simply look at before we get into other examples. Now that we have our dodge and burn in our cleanup folder here, make sure you save again. That way you don't lose those folders. And at this point in the process, you should have something that is relatively what you like when it comes to skin tones and the skin color itself, and just a lot of the evenness. It should be complete at this point. And if it isn't, revisit some of those folders and layers to get to that point before you do some of the color work. Now, a question I get asked a lot is, should you do your color work in the raw stage or should you do it in Photoshop? This all depends on a few factors. And I know I keep saying it depends a lot, but the truth is it does. And that's why retouching is so difficult, because you sometimes can't validate some of the reasons unless you really think about it. And you have to really think. It's not something that you should follow just because someone says you should do, but it's something that you should have the tools to consider. Obviously there are rules, but when it comes to color, there are more exceptions. Exception number one, when it comes to the raw file, a raw file is great for things like exposure. You have a lot of information, but it also has a lot of color information as well. It's not just the exposure and the highlights and shadows that has the detail in the raw file, but when it comes to things like taking out blues and adding in oranges or whatever it is that relates to color, the raw file has a lot more leverage than you do when you come into Photoshop and have adjustment layers. And yes, it's true that adjustment layers are very powerful, and a lot of people like myself also use adjustment layers, but you'll notice limitations in how natural things are. A good reference point is if you ever use exposure in Photoshop to recover blown out highlights after the file's already opened, you'll notice that sometimes it's not possible. But if you go to the raw file and you bring back some highlights, you'll notice that the detail is there. So the same thing relates to color. If there's something that you're trying to do and the raw file necessarily doesn't have, the Photoshop file itself can't deliver for you, then maybe you should be doing it in the raw stage. But it just depends. For me, I'm going to do it in Photoshop because the benefit of doing it in Photoshop is that you can undo everything you've done. Also, once the skin is done and the hair is done, everything looks nice, you can actually add it on top and make it look pretty decent because you know what the retouched image already looks like. So for this part, I'm going to do it here in Photoshop. Now let's say that we add a quick color toning folder. And this is going to be a simplified color toning example to give you a quick taste of how it works with portraits, for me at least. Now, portraiture is interesting because it plays a lot with emotion and mood. And for me, color personally is something that I rely on. I don't have a lot of rules for it per se. I'm not exceptionally great with color when it comes to that part. But what I do like to do is give people the tools to explore their color potential. And I say that because everybody has their own unique taste and flavor in how they do color work. Like, again, if you look at Danny and some of the color work he does, it's really beautiful. He really has a keen eye and sense of how he ties in some of the color. And when you look at his tutorial, you get to see some of that vision, and color is about that vision. The quickest way for me that I really like to work with and adding color, generally speaking, is going through the curves method. And as I mentioned, we'll be going over different topics and how to do different color toning based on lifestyle images and beauty images. But for now, let's take a simple look at color toning. Say we have our color here, or our curves here. We obviously know we can adjust our curves through exposure, and we can see that we've changed some of the properties of how dark or bright this is. That's great, but we can also do that through some of the color channels. So for instance, if I click on the blue color channel, and let's, in theory, say that I want to cool down some of the shadows to complement some of the warmth in the highlights and some on the expression. I'll come over here where some of the shadows are pretty much hiding or laying, click on the curve itself. And I will use my arrow keys on my keyboard to go up and down. And you'll notice that as I do that, it goes up in increments of 1 on the output. I do that a lot because if you try to use your mouse or your stylus, sometimes it's really hard to control that little dot on the curve. So I'm gonna go up here on the curve and you can see some of the coolness coming into the shadows. And then I'm gonna add another dot on top, let's say where the highlights begin on this particular image. You can see that because of the histogram here. And I'm going to pull it down. So we have a typical cross-process look. And I'm just adding some cool tones in the shadows and some warmth into the highlights to compensate for that. When I turn that on and off, you can see that the change itself, although subtle, has a nice balance to it. It adds a little something extra, something special, and it's just enough to complement and offset the mood you're going for. The best thing about this is if you have any reference images and you see some portraits done by particular people and everything else matches, the lighting style, the setting, the depth of field, then the color is essentially the primary difference in what's left over. And if you try to replicate and take some of those references and put it into your own work, the color adds a nice effect in getting close to the inspiration that you're going for. In this instance, I don't have an inspiration and I'm going off the emotion that she's giving me in this image. But if I, have a particular color palette that I like, I can use that color palette and use curves to cross-process images and get a nice quick tone that can be easily applied across multiple images or the style that you want. So overall, that's a quick look at simplified color toning using cross-processing. And we'll be going over complex examples as well through the other tutorials.